Some choices don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warnings or dramatic moments of clarity. They arrive quietly, in the middle of a Thursday night, in an empty office, when someone covers your hand with theirs, and suddenly the decision you've been avoiding becomes the only one that makes sense. Mabel Kingsley didn't come to Chicago to fall for anyone. She came to build something that was entirely her own. But the thing about building a life from scratch is that you can't always control what and who ends up being part of the foundation. Declan Abernathy had been watching her long before she knew she was worth watching. And now that she did, now that she'd stopped pretending she didn't feel it, everything was about to get a great deal more complicated. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Part 2 starts now. Staying meant paperwork. That was the first thing. A formal request from Declan to HR to extend the temporary reassignment indefinitely, pending Christine's full recovery timeline. Mabel signed her portion on a Friday morning without ceremony, slid it across the table to his assistant, and told herself it was a professional decision based on professional merit. She was getting less convincing, even to herself. What staying actually meant, in practice, was that the careful distance she'd maintained for 6 weeks quietly dissolved without either of them deciding to dissolve it. It happened in small increments. He started sending her articles in the evening, not work-related ones, just things he'd read that made him think she'd have an opinion. A piece on urban architecture in cities built around water. A profile of a woman who'd left corporate law to open a bakery in Portland and failed spectacularly, and then tried again. She always responded, usually with one sentence that somehow required him to respond back. By the second week of the new arrangement, they had established something that neither of them had named, but both of them maintained, with the care of something fragile and deliberate. Lunches, occasionally. Not every day. That would have been too obvious, too fast. But Tuesdays and Thursdays, almost reliably, one of them would appear at the other's door around noon with the energy of someone who had a practical reason to be there. They both knew they didn't need one anymore. It was on a Tuesday that she first went to his office rather than the conference room. A real office, not a meeting space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked north toward Lincoln Park, and a desk that was cleaner than she'd expected from a man who ran 4 active accounts simultaneously. She was dropping off revised materials and stayed longer than the materials required because he asked her a question about Nashville that had nothing to do with work, and she answered it honestly, and then he told her something she hadn't known, that he'd grown up in Cincinnati, youngest of 3, in a house where nobody talked about feelings, but everybody kept score. He said it plainly, without weight, the way people mention things they've already made peace with. But Mabel understood what it cost him to say it, because she recognized the particular tone of someone offering a piece of themselves they didn't usually put on the table. She didn't make a thing of it. She just received it, the way you receive something careful, with both hands and without comment. When she stood to leave, he caught her wrist. Not grabbing, just the lightest contact, 2 fingers, enough to stop her without demanding anything. She looked down at his hand and then at his face. "Thursday," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that contains an entire conversation inside a single word. Are we still doing this? Is this real? Will you show up? Do you want to? Thursday, she said. She walked back to her desk with the feeling of someone who had just agreed to something larger than lunch and wasn't even slightly sorry about it. That night, alone in her apartment, she sat with her coffee and looked at the city and allowed herself, for the first time, to think about him without immediately redirecting. About the way his voice dropped slightly when he was being sincere. About his hands. About the fact that she was already looking forward to Thursday with an intensity that had absolutely nothing to do with work. It was the first time she admitted it to herself without flinching. It wouldn't be the last. Thursday came with the kind of gray Chicago sky that makes the city look like a charcoal drawing. Heavy clouds pressing low over the lake, the air carrying that particular cold that settles into the bones before noon. Mabel noticed it from her window before she left for work and thought, without meaning to, that it was the kind of day that made staying in feel like the only reasonable option. She didn't stay in. She arrived at the office at the usual time, worked through the morning with her usual focus, and told herself the mild electricity running through her was just coffee. It wasn't coffee. Declan appeared at her door at 12:15. No pretense this time. No folder, no practical reason staged in his hands. Just him, jacket on, with the particular expression of a man who had decided something and wasn't going to waste time circling it. "There's a place in River North I've been meaning to try," he said. "Come." Not, "Would you like to?" Not, "If you're free, just come." Delivered with that quiet certainty she had stopped finding presumptuous because it had never once felt like it wasn't also an invitation. They took his car, a detail that shifted the dynamic in a way she felt immediately. The driver navigated north through lunch traffic while Mabel sat beside Declan in the back seat, close enough that the warmth of him was a constant, and outside the windows, Chicago moved in its gray and unhurried way. He asked about her morning. She told him, and somewhere in the middle of her answer about a difficult client brief, he smiled. A real one, not the controlled, almost smile she'd cataloged over weeks, but something that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stayed very still. The restaurant was small, Italian, with thick white tablecloths and the smell of garlic and fresh bread that hit them at the door. The host knew Declan by name and led them to a corner table without being asked. She noticed the table was already positioned to accommodate his chair without adjustment. A regular thing, then. Something about that detail, the quiet accommodation of a life lived with intention rather than apology, made her look at him differently across the table. Not with pity, which she'd been careful to never feel. With something warmer and more complicated than that. They ordered. The food was excellent. The conversation moved through 3 different subjects before she realized they'd been there an hour, and neither of them had mentioned work once. At some point, his hand rested on the table between them, and she set hers near it, not quite touching, the way she had in the office on Thursday 3 weeks ago. This time, he didn't just cover it. He turned her hand over, slowly, and ran his thumb along the inside of her wrist. A single, unhurried movement that was so quietly intimate, it took her breath before she could prepare for it. She looked up. He was watching her, with that open expression she was only beginning to understand. The one that meant he had lowered something he usually kept firmly in place. "I'm not good at slow," he said quietly. "I know what I want, and I usually go after it. But I'm aware that's not always..." "Declan." He stopped. She held his gaze. "I'm still here," she said. His thumb stilled against her wrist. The gray city moved outside the window, and something between them, long held at careful distance, finally began to close. She was still there that evening. That hadn't been the plan. The lunch was supposed to be lunch, a contained and reasonable thing, with a beginning and an end, and a clear return to the professional world that existed around them. But the restaurant had emptied around them without either of them noticing, and when the host had come by the 3rd time, with the particular patience of someone too polite to say anything directly, Declan had settled the check and suggested they walk. She'd said yes before remembering that walking beside someone in a wheelchair through River North on a gray Thursday afternoon was not exactly a neutral activity. It wasn't difficult. The neighborhood was navigable, the sidewalks wide enough, and Declan moved with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. What she noticed was how people looked. Some didn't. Some did, with the particular glance that slides away too quickly to be polite. Mabel watched him navigate all of it, without acknowledgement, without irritation, and understood that this was simply part of his daily texture. The world as it actually was, handled with the same composure he applied to everything else. She fell into step beside him and said nothing about it. Which was, she realized later, exactly the right thing. They ended up at his apartment, not with intention, or not with stated intention, which is a different thing. He had a book she'd mentioned wanting to read, he said. She said she'd come up for it. They both understood this was a negotiation conducted entirely in subtext, and chose not to examine it too closely. His apartment was on the 18th floor of a building in Streeterville, modern, spare, with the kind of deliberate order that spoke of a man who had rebuilt his environment from the ground up and made every choice consciously. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced east toward the lake, which was slate gray and enormous in the late afternoon light. She stood at the glass and looked out while he moved to the bookshelf behind her. "It's a good view," she said. "It's why I'm here," he said. Then, after a beat, "One of the reasons." She turned from the window. He was holding the book but not offering it yet, watching her with that open expression she'd seen at the restaurant, the one that cost him something. The apartment was quiet around them. The city moved far below. She crossed the room toward him slowly, and when she reached him, she didn't take the book. She put her hand against his jaw instead, gentle, deliberate. The first time she had touched his face, and felt him go very still beneath her palm, the way something does when it has been waiting. He reached up and covered her hand with his, the same way he had in the office weeks ago, but different now. Everything was different now. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and certain, and nothing like a question. His hand moved from hers to the curve of her waist, and she felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her shirt, like something she had been cold without for longer than she'd known. She didn't think about the office. She didn't think about what came next. She thought about his mouth and his hands and the gray lake behind them, and the specific quality of silence that fills a room when two people have finally stopped pretending. Outside, Chicago continued in its indifferent and beautiful way. Inside, something that had been building for weeks, quietly and completely, arrived. She stayed until the city outside went fully dark. That wasn't planned either, but the evening had its own logic, and she'd stopped arguing with it somewhere around the 3rd hour. They'd ordered food at some point, Thai, delivered to the lobby and brought up by the concierge, and eaten at his kitchen table with the easy comfort of people who had moved past the stage of performing casualness and arrived at the actual thing. It was during dinner that he told her, not dramatically, not with the weight of a confession, just plainly, the way he handled most things that mattered. They'd been talking about something else entirely when he set down his fork and looked at her with that particular directness she had learned meant he was about to say something he'd decided not to hold back anymore. "There's something I want you to know," he said, "before this goes further." She waited. "The accident affected a lot of things," he said. "My mobility, obviously. Some other things, but not everything." He held her gaze steadily, giving her the information without drama, without asking for a specific reaction, just the truth, offered cleanly, by a man who had long since made his peace with it, and was now simply making sure she had what she needed to make hers. Mabel understood immediately what he meant. She felt the care in it, the deliberate honesty of someone who respected her enough not to let her discover it later, in a moment when later would have been too late. She didn't look away. She didn't reach for something reassuring to say that would have made it about her comfort rather than his honesty. She just nodded, once, and said, "Thank you for telling me." Something in his shoulders released, barely perceptible, but she caught it. The small exhale of a man who had been carrying a specific tension and had just set it down. They finished dinner. The conversation moved on, lighter now, as if the honesty had cleared space for something easier to breathe in. Later, on the couch, she was reading. She'd finally accepted the book, and he was working on something on his laptop beside her, the lamp throwing warm light across the room, the lake a dark presence beyond the glass. It was so ordinary, it almost undid her. She had spent so long building a life that was entirely hers, structured around her own independence and her own choices, that she had quietly stopped imagining it could also contain someone else without shrinking. This didn't feel like shrinking. His hand found her knee at some point, just resting there, warm and unhurried, while his eyes stayed on his screen. She turned a page. Outside, the wind moved off the lake and pressed against the glass, and the city glittered below them in that particular way Chicago does in November, cold and bright and completely indifferent to the small private worlds being built inside its buildings. When she finally gathered her coat and her bag and said goodnight, he walked her to the door, and before she stepped into the hallway, he caught her hand, turned it over, and pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist. Warm, deliberate, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had taken weeks to write. She rode the elevator down with her hand against her chest and a feeling she had no immediate plans to name, because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. She wasn't ready to think about losing this yet. The email arrived on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the Thursday that had changed everything. Abel was at her desk, coffee in hand, when she saw the sender. Meridian Group, one of the most aggressive communications firms in the city, headquartered in a building she could see from the 14th floor if she leaned slightly to the left. She almost didn't open it. She did. The offer was specific, generous, and clearly researched. Director of Strategic Communications, a title 2 levels above her current position, with a salary that made her set down her coffee. Relocation optional. The role was Chicago-based. They'd been watching her work, the email said. The Callaway presentation had circulated in certain circles. They wanted to meet. She read it twice, closed her laptop, and sat with it for the rest of the morning without telling anyone. Not because she was seriously considering it, or that's what she told herself at first, but because the offer had surfaced something she hadn't expected. The realization that she didn't know with any clarity what she was staying for. The work at Hartwell was good. The extension had been her choice. But Declan was also a fact of her life now, in a way that hadn't been true 8 weeks ago. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that the lines had blurred in directions she hadn't fully mapped. She went to lunch alone that Tuesday, sat at a window table at a place on Michigan Avenue she'd never been to, ordered soup she barely tasted, and thought about Nashville, about her mother's voice on the phone last week, carefully neutral, asking if she was happy in Chicago, about what happy actually meant when you were building something real versus when you were simply running from something old. She hadn't responded to the Meridian email by Wednesday. On Thursday, their Thursday, Declan noticed. He didn't ask directly. He was too precise for that. But midway through the afternoon, he looked up from his screen and said, "You're somewhere else today." "I'm right here." "Physically," he said. She looked at him across the table. He waited, in that way of his that never felt like pressure, but always felt like an open door. "I got a job offer," she said. The quality of the silence that followed was different from other silences. She watched him process it, not with alarm, not with the performative casualness of someone pretending not to care, with the careful stillness of a man deciding what the honest response actually was. What kind of offer? She told him, the title, the firm, the number. She watched his jaw tighten slightly, just once, just for a second, before he settled back into composure. "That's a serious offer," he said. "I know. Are you considering it?" She paused, and in that pause lived everything she hadn't said yet. About what they were, about what she needed it to be, about the specific fear of having built something she wanted to keep, and not knowing if keeping it required her to stay small inside it. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He nodded, looked back at his screen, and the afternoon continued around them with the terrible normalcy of something that was quietly breaking. That night, she opened her laptop and stared at the Meridian email for a long time. Her cursor hovered over the reply button, and then, without fully deciding to, she closed it. But she didn't delete it. She declined the offer on a Friday morning. No lengthy deliberation, no list of pros and cons spread across her kitchen table. She simply woke up, made her coffee, sat at the window with the lake gray and enormous in the early light, and understood with the quiet certainty of something that had already been decided, that she wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't about the job. It wasn't even entirely about Declan, though he was woven through the decision in ways she was done pretending otherwise. It was about the fact that for the first time in her adult life, she was somewhere she had chosen completely on her own terms, and leaving it would mean letting fear make the call she was too afraid to make herself. She typed the reply to Meridian in 4 sentences, thanked them, declined, closed the laptop. Then she put on her coat and went to find him. She didn't call ahead. Declan was at his apartment. It was early enough that the office wouldn't have him yet, and when the concierge rang up and he said to send her in, she rode the elevator with her heart doing something she'd stopped trying to manage. He opened the door himself, already dressed, coffee in hand, with the expression of a man who had spent the better part of a week holding himself very carefully together and was now recalibrating in real time. She stepped inside. The apartment was full of morning light, the lake brilliant and silver beyond the windows, the city below them just beginning its day. "I turned it down," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb it, not with triumph, not with the relief of someone who had been waiting to win something, with something more careful than that, more real. "Why?" he asked. Because she wanted him to hear it clearly. Because he was the kind of man who needed the honest answer, not the comfortable one. She looked at him steadily and said, "Because I stopped running. And when I did, I realized I was already where I wanted to be." He set his coffee down on the table beside him, moved toward her with that unhurried certainty she had loved before she let herself call it love, and stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. "I need you to know something," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "I don't do this. I haven't done this, not like this, in a long time. And I'm aware that I'm not always easy." "You're never easy," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "No." "I'm not either," she said. "I know." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair from her face with the backs of his fingers. Slow, deliberate, the kind of touch that carries the full weight of a decision. "Then stay," he said. "Not for the job. Not for any reason you'll second guess at 2 a.m. His eyes held hers. "Stay because you want this. Because you want me. And I'll spend a considerable amount of time making sure you don't regret it." She laughed. A real one, sudden and warm, the kind that surprised her. And then she leaned in and kissed him, her hands finding his shoulders, and he kissed her back with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been waiting with complete confidence that she would get here eventually. Outside, Chicago moved in its loud and indifferent and extraordinary way. The lake catching the morning light, the traffic building on Michigan Avenue, the city utterly unconcerned with the small and significant thing happening on the 18th floor. Inside, Mabel Kingsley stood in the arms of a man who had seen her clearly from the very beginning, in a city she had chosen, in a life that was entirely and completely hers. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. If this story moved you, drop your score in the comments, 1 to 10. We read every single one. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.